sorry. I am Nina Carter, and I am the president of the World Affairs Council in Olympia. And thank you for joining us tonight. We're glad to see everybody here. And you'll have to just, pardon me, while I have to also admit people into the room here. But what I wanted to thank you all for doing is joining us tonight and also supporting OWAC. Olympia World Affairs Council would not exist if we didn't have donations and membership from folks like you on this Zoom call today. And if you're curious about getting to be our member, you can always go to our website, and there are buttons that you can push to donate and to become a member. And so what I'm going to do right now is I am going to turn the hosting over to Karen Venezuela. Karen, because there are lots of folks making their way into the waiting room, and I'd like to make a few more comments. So if you could let them in.
All right.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So first of all, for tonight's program, I wanted to specifically thank Ann Berry. Ann Berry has been a member for a long time, and we wanted to commemorate this talk to her. This is the Ann Berry talk tonight because she gave us a very amazing donation, $1,000. So thank you, Ann. And it is so important because we know that you were in the Foreign Service, and you and your husband, Max. Apparently they met in the Middle East, got engaged in Singapore, and got married in Baghdad. And they were a couple, and she was not allowed to serve in the Foreign Service. It was her husband at the time, but he served out his term and then she applied. So they spent their whole careers living overseas. Apparently her husband was the person that reported on the shooting of the vice president of Turkey. And then Anne wrote articles and talked about the economies of Greece and London and Paris and South Africa. So they have been very involved with foreign affairs, foreign issues, and living overseas. And we just wanted to thank her so much for the donation and to dedicate this talk to her. And so for the two presentations tonight in February, I just wanted to mention that yes, they are on Zoom. And as I explained before, we're having some difficulties doing the hybrid at this point. So this talk and February will still be on Zoom, and hopefully we can come back in March in person. And that will be over at our location in Lacey at the Economic Development Council, the EDC building at the SPCC campus. Also, just a couple of notes on Zoom. Everybody should turn their microphones off and probably your videos, because then there'll be better, I don't know, little electronics going back and forth, and they can get to your screen better. And I also wanted to let you know that we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen where it says chat, you can put in your questions there. And a couple of more thank yous. I wanted to thank our board members, Jane Stone, Sherry Bondurant, and not Bondurant, Sherry Brunell, and Amy Van Circum for getting the flyers out and getting the notices out, but in particular, Karen Venezuela, who connected Tom with us for tonight's presentation. And I know Karen will always be a good conduit for more speakers for us. And so finally, to Tom's background. Tom, you have lived in Olympia, Thurston County for over 30 years, and you've served in community development and education and health, environmental and transportation organizations, not only in staff positions, but also leadership and consulting roles. And Tom's amazing accomplishments are pretty impressive. He's currently serving as the board president for the Thurston Climate Action Team and is a founding member of TCAT. And he'll tell us more about that in a minute. And he led the county's first comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory. He worked with the Thurston Economic Development Council in establishing an energy efficiency program for homeowners and small businesses. And he initiated the successful TCAT campaign to get local governments' commitment to drastically reducing our carbon pollution. And he also offers training on sustainability in Thurston County and all over Puget Sound, with numerous presentations to elected officials. Those are the ones that have to hear it. And last but not least, Tom has worked with Native American education projects in the Pacific Northwest and also state transportation agencies nationwide. So we are very privileged to have Tom here. And so I will let you, Tom, share your screen and talk to us a little bit about what's happening here in Thurston County. Thank you.
It says that it says host disabled participant screen sharing somehow here. So I'm not able to share my screen right now. You're muted, Nina.
Sorry about that. Karen, can you give me the host, or can you give Tom the sharing the screen?
Let me give that a try.
I think you could let Tom share the screen. If you hover over his name,
Aha. Okay.
and then I think you can do that.
Stop video, spotlight, make host, allow to record. No, none of my options allow me to do it. So let me give the host back to you, Nina.
Okay, let's do that. And then, sorry for the delay, folks. Technology, it's wonderful. Okay, let me see. Now I'm gonna try to, okay. Now try it, Tom.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, now I'll mute myself and you have the floor, or do you have the screen? I don't know. You have whatever.
Okay, let's see. Yeah. Hold on. Let me, I need to fix something before I share my screen. All right. I got off my Zoom, my presentation, and so there we go. And let's try one more thing here. There we go. Is that visible now to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Nina and Karen and the rest of the board and all the volunteers and participants here at the Olympia World Affairs Council. Thank you for the great work that you do. I like to start my presentations like this with a reminder to myself, at least, that I'm a guest on Indigenous land. So I like to start with what we call land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land and water is the traditional territory of the Stechas people. The Stechas people are of the Squaxin Island tribe. The surrounding mountains, valleys, shorelines, and waterways are imbued with their presence. We seek to nurture our relationship with our Coast Salish neighbors and our shared responsibilities to this place, their homelands, where we mutually abide. So again, with that, again, thank you to the Olympia World Affairs Council, to my friend Karen Valenzuela, other officers, volunteers, etc. You're doing great work in building our awareness and understanding of international developments and their meaning for us here in Thurston County. Thank you also for this opportunity to talk with you about climate change as a global issue and local responses to the issue. I'd like to start with a personal story. A few years ago, I attended a wake and funeral on the Colville Indian Reservation for a man I had known when I was doing education work on the reservation. In conversations with family members, I learned that he never really recovered from the physical and emotional violence he experienced while at an Indian boarding school, and that likely led to his early violent death. The funeral happened to coincide with a major fire up and down, a wildfire up and down the Okanagan Valley. So when we were driving home afterward, we saw miles and miles of scorched earth, burned out buildings, blackened trees. Because of my work with climate change, I knew that I was seeing a direct and violent effect of climate breakdown. I began to see a connection between social violence, for example, the oppression and violence inflicted for generations on Indigenous people, and violence against the earth, human tragedy linked to devastation of the land. This is a theme I'd like to explore with you this evening in the context of our global challenge of climate breakdown. So let's start with the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of violence. And this, by the way, is a picture of that fire that I witnessed, the devastation in the Okanagan Valley. So let's start with the Oxford English Dictionary's definition. The dictionary says it's the exercise of physical force so as to inflict injury on or cause damage to persons or property. Before we go on, I think it's important to note that one unstated assumption of this definition is that violence is inflicted by humans, either as institutions, organizations, or individuals. Typically, we also assume that violence is inflicted pretty directly and immediately. With climate-related violence, I think it's important to understand that violence can be traced to human actors over a period of time and have devastating global effects. Because of the dramatic increase in heat-trapping greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere over the last several decades, global changes in climate have led to ever-increasing levels of destruction that are happening now, from hurricanes, fires, floods, droughts, and other so-called natural disasters. This expansion of time frame and geographic distance keeps hidden the true source of this destructive power and even its human causation. I propose for us to clearly understand what's going on here and why we need to pull back these layers of time and distance to trace the climate-related violence we experience to its true sources, chiefly fossil fuels, land conversion and deforestation, and agricultural practices. Again, all based on human action. Next, let's turn our attention to the violence we frequently see these days in news reports, in our air, our backyards, and our streets. The effects of climate breakdown. The global impact this year was truly devastating, and it was based again on those three factors of extraction, land conversion, and agricultural practices. According to a mid-December report by the UK organization Christian Aid, the 10 most expensive climate disasters in 2022 cost a total of $168 billion. Millions were displaced and thousands died. The true cost is hidden because of the way we define, quote, cost. Buildings, equipment, and other goods are not valued as highly in developing countries and low-income communities. So the economic impact on those countries will always be lower than for wealthier countries. Here are some of the details behind the climate disaster in Pakistan that we've heard a lot about. From mid-June to the end of August, Pakistan experienced very intense rainfall, coincident with the monsoon season. The month of August was the wettest since 1961. Rainfall that month was 37% higher than the average for the whole monsoon season. As a result of these intense rains, large parts of the country were underwater. The floods killed 1,700 people, 1.1 million livestock, and destroyed an estimated area of 9.4 million acres of crops. The World Bank estimated that the floods could drive up to 15 million people into poverty. This is the 8th most vulnerable country due to climate change, according to the 2021 Global Climate Risk Index. While insured losses were estimated at 5.6 billion, the total economic losses were much larger. And we also know that in poor countries, low-income countries like Pakistan, many of the losses were uninsured. An assessment by the World Bank concluded that the damages from the floods and the economic losses exceeded $30 billion, and that the country needs more than $16 billion for its reconstruction. A study conducted by the World Weather Attribution Group concluded that climate change likely increased the abnormally high monsoon rain over Pakistan that led to the floods. And at the same time, Pakistan has only contributed about 0.3% of all greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So this is just one example of what we're looking at and the damage we're talking about here. Environmental violence from climate change includes, from a Natural Resources Defense Council report of October of last year, loss of sea Arctic ice, sea level rise that erodes coastal ecosystems and invades freshwater inland aquifers, extreme weather, especially warmer winters and sudden heavy downpours, expected to increase our nation's floodplains by approximately 45% by 2100. Warmer and more acidic oceans as they absorb 90% of the heat trapped by greenhouse gases and 30% of the carbon dioxide we emit. As fish change their migration patterns in response to heat waves, marine food webs are disrupted. Plankton and marine mammals die off en masse. At the same time, increased acidification disrupts the calcification process for shellfish. And we know that calcification process is a real critical issue here in our local communities and with our shellfish industry. Increased outbreaks of pests, invasive species, and pathogen infections in forest are also another effect. Changes to the kind of vegetation that can thrive in a given region, and disruptions to the life cycles of wildlife, which in turn changes the composition of ecosystems and makes them less resilient to stressors. Let's turn now to the social violence, that is, the violence against human beings resulting from the climate breakdown. A convenient top-line way of doing this is to consider the cost in dollars and lives. Both of these can be difficult to accurately assess, but here's what we know so far. In 2012, the American Security Project estimated the annual cost of climate change in dollars and human lives. This is what they said. Climate change is currently costing the global economy, and that was in 2012, $1.2 trillion per year, equivalent to about 1.6% of global GDP. That estimate comes from a report released by a humanitarian group, DARA, and the Climate Vulnerable Forum. The human cost is also huge. An estimated 400,000 people die each year due to hunger and diseases related to climate change. And again, this is according to the American Security Project. By 2030, the death toll is expected to rise to 700,000 lives per year, and cost the global economy 2.5% of GDP annually. Again, up from the current 1.6%. Next, we have a Lancet paper published late last year that reached the following conclusions. Extreme weather events caused damage worth US $253 billion in 2021, particularly burdening people in low Human Development Index countries, in which almost none of the losses were insured. So here again, we can see distribution of fatalities by some of the countries that are experiencing the highest level of deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. Myanmar is at the top of the list, unfortunately, all the way down to France and Italy. So nobody is immune, but you can see the pattern of who is suffering the most. Here are photos of two examples of the human cost of the climate breakdown. First, these are homes demolished by Hurricane Dorian when it hit the mud neighborhood in the Marsh Harbor area of Abaco, Bahamas in September of 2019. And this is a photo of soy production in Brazil's southernmost state, which is declining due to adverse weather. And you can see the at least a hint of the crop devastation that's taking place there. In the US, billion-dollar climate catastrophes are also multiplying. Between January and September of 2022, there were 15 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the US. And you can see they're all over the country, not so much in the Pacific Northwest, at least not yet, but yeah, it has been predicted for some time that we will be a little better off than most, but we will still suffer some indirect effects like food, more expensive food and food shortages and difficulties with the energy distribution system and that sort of thing. Locally, we've seen climate breakdown significantly affect us here in Thurston County. This has included wildfires and wildfire smoke, flooding from large rainstorms coinciding with snowmelt, sea level rise, ocean acidification, temperature extremes, timber infestation, and salmon runs that are less than 10% of their numbers in 1980. The recent king tide, pictured here, gave us a glimpse of Olympia's future under climate breakdown. Violence associated with climate breakdown can also be traced to the ways in which fossil fuels, the largest human contributor to climate change, are mined, processed, and burned to produce energy and products and for our transportation system. Extraction and transporting of oil, coal, and other fossil fuels from the earth has historically been fraught with pollution, disease, worker risk, cultural destruction, and other forms of violence. This is Josiah Edwards, 21, who grew up near the largest oil refinery on the West Coast in Wilmington, California. Oil drilling and refineries were always an ever-present background in my life, he said. A report from CNBC related that Wilmington, a predominantly working class and Latino immigrant community of more than 50,000 people, has some of the highest rates of asthma and cancer in the state, according to a report by the nonprofit Communities for a Better Environment. It's surrounded by 6 oil refineries and wedged in by several freeways and the ports of LA and Long Beach. Citing again the American Security Project's 2012 study, in addition to climate change, the current pollution-intensive energy system extracts further damage, 4.5 million annual deaths due to air pollution, indoor smoke, occupational hazards, and cancer. Closer to home, the Centralia coal mine and plant, which closed in 2016, had a severe effect on our local environment and people. Environmental destruction caused by the extraction and processing of fossil fuels is closely linked to human and social impacts. We get a glimpse of this in this photo of the Suncor mine and tailings pond near Fort McMurray in Alberta, Canada. Toxic chemicals in the air, water, and soil damage our lungs, cause cancer, and rob us of safe drinking water. Destruction of trees and other vegetation and habitat leave us without healthy recreation sites and damage air, water, and land. And this is just touching the surface of violence. Consider the violence associated with exploitative labor practices common in the fossil fuel industries, along with the violence on local communities perpetrated by workers brought in to extract oil, gas, and coal. The recent campaign to find and bring justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women has revealed the violence to Indigenous women that results from establishing so-called man camps for imported fossil fuel workers in or near Indigenous communities, where much of the fossil fuel extraction in North America is taking place. Who is harmed most severely by all of this climate violence? As affirmed recently at the COP27 conference in Egypt, those countries who have contributed least to the problem tend to be those who feel the most severe impacts. And they recognize this by pledging to set up a fund to support those countries. Sometimes called the Global South or the low HDI or Human Development Index countries, these countries do not have the financial or other resources necessary to leapfrog over the use of fossil fuels to create economies based on renewable energy sources, nor do they have the resources or infrastructure required to respond and adjust to the massive violence already taking place or about to take place in their countries due to climate change. And so this map shows results of an index of climate risk. And so the deeper red colors obviously indicate higher climate risk, and the lighter colors low climate risk. The gray indicates that data was not available for this particular analysis from those countries. Even in more wealthy countries like the US, social, economic, and historical forces turn climate violence into social violence, especially aimed at BIPOC and poor people. Poor people have fewer resources, such as decent housing, health insurance, and access to nutritious food, to insulate themselves from climate disasters. Indigenous people are losing their homes and their natural abundance and the natural abundance that have been at the center of their cultures and economies for generations. Black and other people of color with little generational wealth accumulation live in communities and neighborhoods next to wells, mines, refineries, and dirty plants, making them vulnerable to all the diseases associated with the toxic substance in their air, water, and soil. That's why these communities are often called sacrifice zones. At the same time, climate catastrophes are overwhelming the ability of public government institutions to respond to them. Government agencies are organized to respond to historic conditions and tend to be siloed and not well coordinated with one another. They are also not funded at the scale required for the increased frequency and severity of these climate disasters, and are hamstrung by a lack of flexibility in how they address the needs of disaster victims. This often leaves families in temporary housing and disrupts their employment and income. Regaining permanent housing, often at a higher cost, can take months, even years after the disaster. And this woman and her child are awaiting eviction from FEMA housing because they've overstayed the amount of time that's available, and they'll have to find housing, and they'll have to pay for the housing that it now costs. It'll cost them $500 a month more than it previously cost them before they had to go into FEMA housing. So let's turn now to who benefits from climate disruption and climate breakdown. Can we actually say anyone benefits? Well, it turns out that there are a few people who are benefiting from the industries that are most responsible for this catastrophe. That's I classify those as relatively short-term benefits, but they're still there. And those who benefit tend to be those who are already well off and have protective resources. So first of all, oil, coal, and fossil gas companies have seen their profits soar in recent years. They benefit from the sale of fossil fuels, which add to heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In an October 2022 article, the New York Times reported, according to the International Energy Agency, the net income for the world's oil and natural gas producers is set to double in 2022 from 2021 to a new high of $4 trillion. Of course, that increase in profits is not directly related to climate change, but I think we can trace the path, from climate disasters to some of the global conflicts that are leading to these increased revenues. As a side note, we have known for some time that ExxonMobil scientists predicted the effects on the global climate from burning fossil fuels. A new report out of Harvard this month confirms how accurately ExxonMobil scientists predicted global temperature changes, while the company continued to cast doubt on that very science. Besides fossil fuel companies, weapon manufacturers also stand to gain from the global instability created by our climate breakdown. As food shortages, heat waves, floods, and hurricanes lead to political upheaval, mass migrations, and other crises, military conflicts become more likely. The demand for arms rises. In fact, in 2021, global military spending surpassed $2 trillion. This spending means that national governments are spending less to combat climate change and less on health, education, food, and other humanitarian programs, further exacerbating the climate crisis and its impact on people around the world. According to a December 2022 article in Forums, sales of arms and military services by the world's 100 largest defense companies rose 1.9% last year to reach $592 billion, according to a newly released data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. There is another way in which climate breakdown benefits large corporate interests. The chaos created by climate change, including the inability of public services to respond quickly with sufficient resources, gives an opening to politicians who wish to weaken national governments in order to increase the power and profits of large corporate interests. The increased influence of these corporations at the expense of people at the margins and of democratic institutions is compounded by the effect of top-down globalization. Both Naomi Klein and Anthony Lowenstein have documented this in their books. Naomi's book is The Shock Doctrine, and Anthony's book is Disaster Capitalism. So this is a photo of a man in Puerto Rico. He's surveying the damage in his neighborhood after Hurricane Maria in 2017. In response, the electric grid was privatized and little government funding or NGO assistance was delivered. As a result, when Hurricane Fiona hit last year, the island had still not recovered from Hurricane Maria. And so there, I don't know to what extent Telesforo's home has been restored. I would say it's doubtful. The climate breakdown has also generally been good for countries in cooler climates who tend to be better off economically. In the 2019 article, the BBC reported the gap between the world's poorest and richest countries is about 25% larger today than it would have been without global warming, according to the Stanford University researchers in California. So let's turn now to what's being done. Let's turn now to some good news and some progress. And let's start with kind of looking at where we are in terms of climate change, creating greenhouse gas emissions, and how we're doing to bring those down. So unfortunately, worldwide, it doesn't look all that great right now. According to a 2020 study of worldwide emissions, we collectively emit right now around 50 billion tons of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent each year. This is more than 40% higher than emissions in 1990, which were around 35 billion tons. We've been hearing a lot about the Ukraine war and its possible effect on various countries' ability and willingness to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. And so we know that it was one of 2022's most significant challenges to progress on climate change. That conflict has captured headlines across the world, and competition over fossil fuels has become a central feature of that war. Europe's initial reaction to Russia interrupting its fossil gas supplies was to fall back on other fossil fuels, which would simply perpetuate the ecological and social violence associated with the climate breakdown. However, it now appears that the more lasting response may be in the opposite direction, to promote more renewable energy. According to a recent report by the International Energy Agency, due to this shift, by 2025, they expect that renewables are likely to surpass coal as the world's largest energy source. Other international climate developments this year included the cost of renewable energy has fallen dramatically since 2010. Solar power and lithium battery technology has fallen 85% and wind power by 55%. So that makes it much more economically attractive to implement those technologies. We also know that net zero emission pledges now cover most of humanity and address 80% of global emissions. Countries that, emissions that come from those countries. The European Union strengthened it recently and expanded its carbon market, which encourages companies to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. This includes taxing imports from countries that do not have similar policies. We've also heard some about what went on at COP27 in Egypt. COP stands for the Conference of Parties, and there's one held every year. So this is the 27th such conference has been held on International Conference on Climate Change. At this COP27, there was an agreement to create a loss and damages fund to help countries most harmed by climate change, climate breakdown. So that's very good news. On the other side of the equation, however, the nations with the largest carbon emissions effectively weakened, in some respects, their commitment to reduce those emissions. Specific commitments from COP27 included a resolution to cause emissions to peak by 2025 was taken out of the International Climate Agreement. India and other countries lobbied to go beyond the previous year's commitment to phase out coal to include all fossil fuels. That proposal failed. But there was a reference was added to tipping points. That reference was added to the international agreement, along with a reference to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Political changes in Brazil and Australia, along with a reset in the relationship between the US and China, is likely to lead to greater progress on climate in those countries and worldwide. For example, we'll see increased preservation of the Amazon rainforest. I'm sorry, went one too far, one slide too far. So this is obviously is the new president of Brazil. And so that election will probably lead to increased preservation of the Amazon rainforest, which is very good for bringing down, drawing down our carbon dioxide. Additional countries, including Australia, have signed on to a pledge to cut methane emissions, bringing the total number of countries signing that pledge to 150. In the US, President Biden is pushing energy companies to further reduce methane leaks in their transmission lines. The agreement at COP27 to establish a loss and damages fund for countries most harmed is very encouraging and can help heal the climate-related violence in those countries. However, if the polluting countries do not achieve the necessary reductions in greenhouse gas pollution, reductions beyond even their most ambitious commitments to date, those efforts could be quickly overwhelmed by even more severe catastrophes due to climate breakdown. Let's turn now to the US. I'll take a little pause here. So the news for greenhouse gas emissions in the US is a little more encouraging. According to the EPA, in 2020, US greenhouse gas emissions totaled 5.2 billion, that's billion with a B, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. This was, however, 11% below 2019 emissions and 21% below 2005 emissions. The dip has been primarily assigned to the dramatic decrease in economic activity that we experienced due to COVID. And so it may be challenging as we bring up our economic activity and get back to some more normal level of activity here in the next few years. It might be challenging to maintain those decreases. So policy and investment interventions are going to be very critical to maintaining that decreased level of carbon emissions. In the US, probably the most significant climate action was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. According to a recent report by Rocky Mountain Institute, the bill includes a total of $369 billion invested over 10 years in climate action and energy security, aiming to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by about 40% below 2005 levels in 2030. So that's very good. Probably not sufficient, but we're getting along the path here. We're making the kind of progress we need to make. Secondly, billions of dollars will be available to support domestic sourcing of refining and recycling of critical minerals for electric vehicles. Many tax credits for the purchase of an EV will be expanded and extended. We'll have some money to help communities acquire clean energy buses, transit buses, garbage trucks, etc. We'll have rebates and incentives for new and existing buildings to be more energy efficient. We'll have housing improvements for low and moderate income families who experience disproportionately high energy burden. We'll have continued subsidies for large-scale wind and solar projects, support for low carbon jet fuel, additional tax credits for clean energy produced in places that historically have high employment in coal, gas, and oil industries to help those communities transition their workers, and several other very positive things are contained in that bill. In a not so positive vein, the legislation also directs the federal government to open land leases for oil and gas projects. Development on these leases could increase pollution and sacrifice communities from the Gulf South to Alaska, according to those who are critical of that move. Focusing on transportation, and here's a quick graph that sort of visually depicts how much greenhouse gas emissions are targeted to change under the Inflation Reduction Act compared to current policy. So you can see there's a pretty dramatic reduction planned here. Focusing on transportation, which is one of the top sources of greenhouse gas emissions, there are very positive trends for electric vehicle adoption in this country. For example, General Motors plans to stop selling gas and diesel vehicles by 2035. And so that's very encouraging. Finally, more and more states are including provisions for equity in their climate and energy policies. This is a positive trend and promises to benefit those communities most harmed by climate violence. To summarize, federal and many state governments in the US have taken significant steps. The pollution reduction is probably not sufficient to stay within internationally agreed upon target of 1.5 degrees average temperature above pre-industrial levels. And if those permitted fossil fuel leases are actually purchased, that would be even more problematic. So there's more work to do, and protecting and expanding the policies and the spending committed by federal and state governments this year will require continued advocacy and campaigning by citizens, especially those frontline communities most affected. So let's turn to Washington State now. We do know that in 2019, the latest year for which we have numbers, greenhouse gas emissions in Washington continued to rise, unfortunately, from 93.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent to 102.1 million tons. The bulk of those emissions came from cars and trucks we drive and the energy we use to heat and cool our homes and other buildings. This is in contrast to goals that actually the legislature has committed to. Those are depicted in this chart. So you can see by 2020, the target is to reduce to 1990 levels. Well, it's not clear whether we made that. I'm doubtful that we did make that. We probably almost certainly didn't. But by 2030, 45% below 1990. By 2040, 70% below. And by 2050, 95% below, with that other 5% achieved by offsets. So the legislature and other state agencies have adopted, in order to achieve these targets, they've adopted a series of aggressive policies that may give us a chance to reach these targets. The first one is called the Clean Energy Transformation Act. That was passed in 2019 and requires utilities to phase out coal-fired electricity from their state portfolios by 2025. And so the first step, and then by so that's the first step, and then by 2030, they must be greenhouse gas emissions neutral. And then by 2045, they must supply Washington customers with electricity that is 100% renewable or non-emitting, with no provisions for offset. The Climate Commitment Act was passed by the legislature in 2021, and it creates a cap and invest program that sets ever decreasing levels of greenhouse gas emissions for businesses throughout the state. If they exceed those levels, businesses must pay by purchasing allowances. The funds are then reinvested in helping communities, especially those most affected by carbon pollution, to reduce their pollution levels and improve health and environmental equity statewide. At least 35% of the funds will be invested in projects for overburdened communities, and at least 10% will go to tribal projects. I'm going to skip a couple of things here. We've got new state building codes that require electrification of homes and commercial buildings. We also know there's a clean fuel program that uses a market approach to incentivize fuel producers to reduce the carbon intensity of the products by 20% by 2034. The state is requiring that as of 2035, all new passenger cars, trucks, and SUVs sold in the state be powered by electricity or hydrogen. These policies will result in significant reductions to emissions fairly soon. Already, Puget Sound Energy's emissions are going down. In addition, help for low-income BIPOC and tribal communities promise to provide important support for those in our state most affected. So with quick action, though, we can limit the damage over time and protect our frontline communities throughout the state. Let's turn now to Thurston County. Thurston County's greenhouse gas emissions picture is, I guess, a mixed bag is what I would characterize it. There's some good news in that you can see by the lines, compared to 2015, our total emissions have come down a bit. We are now at 2.1 million tons of carbon CO2 equivalent as compared to 3.1 million tons in 2015, which is the sort of baseline years that Thurston County and local governments are using. But we're still really not on track with the reductions that they've committed to, or the reductions required to keep temperatures below internationally recognized limits. So in early 2021, the cities of Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater, along with Thurston County, approved the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan to achieve 45% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 85% by 2050. Thurston Climate Action Team actively supported the development and approval of this plan. The local government is now working to implement the 72 specific actions contained in the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. And those actions are in 5 areas. First of all, buildings and energy, mainly the energy we use to heat and cool and power our buildings, our homes and our office buildings. Transportation and land use is the second area, water and waste then, and agriculture and forest. And then they have identified a cross-cutting area for general education, policy improvements, advocating with state government, and things like that. So, so far, actions, there have been several actions, even though they're still in the early stages. And those actions have included, they've hired some dedicated sustainability and climate staff, which then allows them to actually focus and spend more time on this issue. They're developing group purchase programs for solar panels and heat pumps. Heat pumps, of course, are much more efficient than regular furnaces, and also use electricity which can be sourced from renewable sources. Our county commission established what's called the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy and Resiliency Program, which provides for innovative financing for clean energy projects throughout the county for commercial buildings. City of Olympia is committed to incorporate into staff reports and recommendations the climate justice impact of all its major decisions. So in other words, they're going to use a climate lens for making their major decisions throughout the city. All local governments are working to improve their review and permitting processes for solar projects and to encourage solar installations. They're working on EV-ready parking. Tumwater is providing incentives for commuters who purchase electric or hybrid vehicles or use public transit. They're doing more outreach to reduce food waste and improvements, as I mentioned, in existing tree ordinances and other policies to encourage preservation of existing trees and good practices for planting more. Thurston Climate Action Team has been actively working and I would say preparing the way for these decisions and these efforts by local government. And so I think I've already mentioned some of the things that we've done, but we've been pretty involved in this the whole way. Other things that we're doing as we continue to work on a variety of fronts to achieve quick and dramatic reductions in local greenhouse gas emissions. We're building relationships with local BIPOC groups and communities and finding ways to ensure the needs of those communities are addressed as TCMP, the Climate Mitigation Plan, is implemented. This particular mural is going up the 4th Avenue Hill, and it's one that we organized and got partnerships with BIPOC artists of color in the community. We're also calling for dramatic increase in funding by local government to implement the mitigation plan. We think within the next few years they need to be spending at least $15 million. They're now committing $2 million, which is a good step up from last year, but we think it needs to be even stronger. Supporting policies to decarbonizing our homes and businesses. So we've strongly advocated for all electric appliance and solar ready buildings and heat pumps policies. We're working on educating the public about the benefits of electric vehicles. And we're working on increased local government transparency and accountability so that these decisions by local governments can be more accessible, and the community can have more input to make sure that they're completing the actions needed to actually achieve the targets in the climate mitigation plan. So moving forward quickly and boldly enough to implement the climate mitigation plan is critical to preserving a healthy community here in Thurston County and to protecting our most vulnerable residents from the worst effects of climate violence. It requires collaboration, and we're to build our collaboration even beyond Thurston County. We're linked up with communities across Washington State who have formed a network to encourage and support policies and investment at the local level to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. So what we do here in Thurston County is part of a statewide movement, and the state of Washington is part of a West Coast movement, having joined California, Oregon, and British Columbia in adopting bold policies and investments to reduce this climate violence and start to protect and support our most vulnerable communities. So as I wrap up, I'd like to invite you to consider how our thinking about climate change and the climate breakdown might change if we saw it as violence against people, our communities, and our democratic institutions. In other words, how might we respond differently if we recognize this as in fact a war on our people and our planet? Some of our local governments have taken the first steps in recognizing the urgency and severity of this crisis by passing resolutions and declaring a climate emergency. So far, those resolutions have not translated into changes in priorities needed. Actions and funding to match the moment are not yet there. In other words, there is much left to be done. Thurston Climate Action Team will continue to press for expanded funding and higher priority for community-wide transformation needed to meet this crisis. I'd like to close by quoting from the Thanksgiving address used by the indigenous Haudenosaunee people in their meetings. Their practices for democratic government were incorporated into the US Constitution. Today, we have gathered and we see that the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty and responsibility to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now we bring our minds together as one, as we give our greetings and our thanks to one another as people. Now our minds are one. We are all thankful to our mother, the earth, for she gives us all that we need for life. She supports our feet as we walk about upon her. It gives us joy that she continues to care for us as she has from the beginning of time. To our mother, we send our greetings and our thanks. Now our minds are one. As we strive to address the global climate breakdown and the violence it inflicts, A unity of purpose and a unity around common needs and the common good will be our greatest challenge and our greatest opportunity. Thank you very much for your time this evening. And now I'll welcome questions.
Thank you. Let me just say again, Mr. Crawford, you have done a lot in your career and continue to do so. And this was very informative from the global perspective all the way down to what is our city council doing. And it happens that today in the Daily Olympian newspaper, which we don't get on paper anymore, we get it online. There was an article about the legislative agenda from the city of Olympia to the legislature. And their first, they have 7 different priorities. The first one is the Deschutes estuary restoration, but the second is climate change initiatives. And they are asking the legislature to help them invest in building electrification to help people transition in their homes and their buildings. And one of my questions for you is, what do you see that looking like? Would Olympia have a grants program where someone could take their fabulous gas stove that they use in their kitchen and turn it into an electric one? So what is your vision of what would that kind of electrification program look like in the city of Olympia or Thurston County?
Well, Olympia definitely is taking has over the last several years had a kind of a first mover position in some of this, and although each of the cities have in their own way taken leadership and done very positive and unique things. I would think that from what I understand of the City of Olympia's initiative, they would probably, I think they're looking first at decarbonizing their own buildings, and they actually have passed a resolution requiring that. But I think then next they will look at, as new homes are built, requiring that those homes be built with all electric appliances, and then move into existing homes from there and probably take a phased in approach. I personally think some kind of an incentive will be important, and that's part of the reason why we're asking for increased funding for climate action. One of the problems that is sometimes cited is there's a provision in the state constitution that prohibits state or any local governments from lending the faith and credit and financing to any private entity or individual. And I'm sure you're very aware of that, Nina. And so, however, the analysis I've seen says that if it's done for a public, a good that they've declared as a public good, then that can be workable. So I think there are clear workarounds around that particular constitutional provision. I don't think that my personal opinion is, given the many resolutions that all of these local governments have passed, they clearly declared their intent, and they're starting to put some money behind this as a public good. Fighting climate change, clearly a public good. That it shouldn't be a barrier.
Okay, and would you mind doing stopping the screen share so we can see?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thanks.
I mean,
Thanks for the reminder. Yes.
Your information, and also we can see if there are any questions. Jack and Donna both said that it was a great presentation, and it's an interesting new way to think about climate breakdown. And I agree, this concept of violence to communities, violence to individuals, as well as the planet, that story isn't told very often. So that's a very interesting way to put it, and as you started out your presentation, that's a way to think about it.
Nina, this is Karen. While we're waiting for other people to put their questions in the chat, Tom, maybe you would be willing to do a follow-on to Nina's question. Has TCAT engaged with the City of Olympia and or the state legislature one of your categories was the transportation and land use sector. And so have you been involved at all in the rather big changes that both the state and certain municipalities are proposing with respect to zoning in their city limits, having to do with where in which neighborhoods can you put lots of different things other than simply single family dwelling units, like, you know, making it easier to do 4 and 6 plexes, or to do something smaller in your large backyard or whatever. So I think you understand what I'm asking you. So have you guys engaged in that with the city or state?
I don't know that we've been engaged much in that particular issue. We generally support anything that increases the efficiency of our homes and businesses, the energy efficiency of our homes and businesses, and to the extent that you know, those kinds of zoning changes accomplish that. I think our volunteers, our members, and so forth would be very supportive of that.
And Tom, there's another question from Roy saying, what would happen? This question is, what would be the effect of a SeaTac size airport be in Thurston County? There's a small question for you.
Yeah. Well, from what I've seen, it doesn't sound like it's very likely to happen. But yeah, I think it would mean lots of traffic and cars coming into our county. So that would increase our greenhouse gas emissions from the standpoint of transportation. And then obviously we'd have to start accounting for a much more significant direct effect of air transportation than we currently have had to do. So those would be big increases in our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you. I think that was Carolyn or Roy asked that question.
And then Jack and Donnie have come back with, is there any money in the Inflation Reduction Act to help cities reduce carbon emissions?
Yes, there's significant money, and I think you saw traces of it when I described some of the programs. But there are, you know, all the way from, you know, helping folks with improving the efficiency of their homes and buildings, to helping communities with EV powered trucks and buses and things like this, or electric powered trucks and buses. Let me go back to that particular part of presentation. But yeah. So you know, tax credits for the purchase of an electric vehicle, making it easier for low and middle income buyers to use it. So that's for individuals. For cities, would be probably, well, as I said, the community, helping communities acquire clean energy transportation, and housing improvements for low and moderate income families. Tax credits. Yeah, there are funds. I don't have the details right here, but there are a number of programs in that legislation that will be available for nonprofits as well as for local governments.
Let me ask you another question, Tom, that came up from John and Mary Beth about what about violence of climate activists, such as destruction of electrical substations? Do you expect that activity to rise?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I think there's a difference between violence against people and violence against ill-gotten property. um, and but we could talk about the fine points of violence versus non-violence. I would hope that we could use our people, we could use our influence, first of all, democratically, if at all possible. But I think young people particularly are becoming very frustrated and very concerned because we're talking about their future. And so I think it's not surprising that you would have activities that are violent, that look violent, perhaps on TV. I think that Martin Luther King and the young people that he organized engaged in activities that I'm sure were shocking to many people in the South and in other parts of the country. I think I personally am an advocate for working through things in as nonviolent manner as possible.
Thank you, Tom. My husband and I just finished watching the movie Gandhi that came out, I don't know, 35, 40 years ago. And it just shows how if you pick a specific nonviolent task that does make an impact, like the production of salt in India, that was what started the change. So I'm hoping that TCAT and others that are working on climate change will be able to do this all in a non-violent way, of course. And there is one other question.
Could I make one other comment about this? Sure. You mentioned TCAT. I think it's important for me to be clear. Thurston Climate Action as an organization is very much oriented toward working with and through other community organizations. So we're very much, I mean, part of the core of the way we see our mission is collaboration with a variety of community organizations. And so those, can run the spectrum. And we particularly, and we are also very, as I think I mentioned, very much engaging these days and working as hard as we can to engage with communities of color in Thurston County, and really support a variety of interests and common goals as much as we can. So, but I just want to say we're very collaborative. We tend to emphasize working on positive solutions, proposing things that are can be done, that city governments can put in their budgets and actually get programs and projects done. So that's our focus.
Thank you. And one of our board members, Anders Price, was saying in the comment section that the recent substation attacks have been linked to common criminals and white supremacists, not climate activists. So there's a whole nother layer of information there. We had another question from Judith regarding the airports and emissions. And she's saying that it seems to me that it would become really easy to say, as long as the airports and other emitters are not in my backyard, I don't have to worry about emissions that are produced. However, is TCAT, the state or other states or the feds, talking about how we deal with those emissions as a whole, not laying them on neighboring areas, states, or countries as their problem, not ours? That's kind of a big question. You get the gist.
As I noted in my comments about state policies and so forth, the state of Washington is very much interested in alternative jet fuels, and particularly, being at least the former home of Boeing, still Boeing is a major employer. And so I know Jay Ensley and others have been working hard on that side of the equation. And I think we may, I mean, this is one of the areas that emissions went down in 2020 because of the pandemic, right? And so to keep those emissions a little lower than normal, hopefully, keep those flights, maybe we don't have to take as many flights as we were used to in the past. So it's not something that we have taken on directly because it's not a big impact right now on greenhouse gas emissions in Thurston County. But I understand the issue, and I think the person who asked the question makes a good point.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. One more question here from Johanna Flynn. She's wondering about the one type of electric battery for cars that wouldn't cause as much climate violence, but it's very expensive. Is there a difference between different car batteries? She wants to know about that. Is there a better car battery than others?
I'm not familiar with that. I couldn't tell you whether. I mean, there are different technologies, but I'm not familiar with the the environmental impact of various batteries. I do think that this is one of the areas, as we depend more on batteries, and we know that it's going to be a challenge to keep up with the demand for lithium and other minerals in the ground that are required for electric vehicle batteries. I think we need to pay careful attention to how those batteries are mined and make sure that that's done in a sustainable way. Ultimately, we need to find ways to restore those resources back into the earth to really be sustainable.
Well, Johanna, if you find out the answer to the question, please let us know.
Right.
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay, Johanna. Thank you for asking. And thank you, Tom. I don't think there are any more questions going once, going twice. I don't see any hands being raised or any questions in the chat. So this has been wonderful presentation, Tom. Thank you. I know everybody here enjoyed it. And we encourage you for your good work because we live here, we all live here, and we appreciate the efforts that you and Melinda and everybody at TCAT are taking on our behalf. So we'll make sure to look up your website and follow your work.
Yeah, please do. Thank you very much. I see Wayne had a hand up there. I don't know.
Wayne did? Oh, he
Oh,
is.
okay.
Perfect. He's doing a clap. Everybody's doing
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, very good. And I will close out the meeting in a few minutes. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and join us again in February for another Zoom presentation. We'll send out notices to everybody to let you know. Thank you so much. Good night.